Thank you. That was such a wonderful introduction. I wish you just could have kept going and going. It was sounding very good. I want to thank Busboys and Poets for hosting this event and for all of the great work you do. Thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody. It's a wonderful crowd, and thank you all very much for coming out. Let me talk a bit about myself, kind of how I got to where I am. Then I'm going to read a few pages. I'll read the introduction to the book. Go on for 7 or 8 hours after that. They didn't tell you that, right? No. And then we'll take some questions and answers at 4 o'clock in the morning. As you heard, I am the longest serving independent in American congressional history, actually, as it were. And you may say, well, why is that? Why are you an independent? And the answer is pretty simple. It's that I believe that both political parties are heavily dominated by moneyed interest. And I think that millions and millions of working families don't have the kind of voice that they should be having in all levels of government. And I've chosen to be an independent. I caucus now with the Democrats, have always done that. I began my political career in Vermont by running for the United States Senate on a third-party ticket, running against Democrats and Republicans. And I received all of 2% of the vote. That was back in roughly 1971. And not deterred, I then ran for governor of the state of Vermont with the same third party called the Liberty Union Party, and I went from 2% to 1%. Not a kind of trajectory that we were hoping. But I may not be very bright, but I am persistent. Came back, ran for the Senate again in 1974 against my now colleague, Patrick Leahy. He won, I lost, but I got 4% of the vote in a three-way race. So I saw the votes going up, and then 2 years later, I ran for governor again. We have elections every 2 years in Vermont, and I got 6%. At that point, I took the hint that maybe getting elected to political office is not what my life was going to be about, and I went about doing other things, mostly doing some writing, working on historical film strips, and actually having a pretty good time. In 1981, you know how politicians always tell you that people came up and said you should run for office, and actually in my case it was true. There were a number of friends who said, you know what, we looked at the election results and you did really well in Burlington, and if you run in Burlington, which is the largest city in the state of Vermont, you might actually win. So I did, and we put together a wonderful coalition of unions and senior citizens and women's advocates and environmental advocates, and the police officers came on board. And on election night, we won by 14 votes, defeating a 5-term incumbent, which will probably go down in Vermont history as maybe the major, most significant political upset of modern Vermont history. Then we went to the recount, and I ended up winning by 10 votes. I took office in 1981 with 2 supporters on the city council, and the rest were Democrats and Republicans who were not particularly supportive. In fact, they fired my secretary on the first day I took office, and I had to run the city for the first year with the previous mayor's administration. It's like Obama running with Bush's administration. It was a little bit difficult, but a year later, we had rallied the people, and we won a number of seats in the city council. I developed veto power, and we began to do some really exciting things in Burlington. After 2 years, I ran for re-election against Democrat-Republican, won. 2 years later, ran against Democrat-Republican, won. And then they combined the parties, and we won anyhow. That was in 1987. 1988, I ran for the United States Congress, and a lot of my liberal friends said, you shouldn't run because you'll be a spoiler. There's a strong Democrat running against a strong Republican. You're going to pull votes away. On election night, the Republican won with 34%. I got 31%. The Democrat got 19%. 2 years later, I ran for that same seat in the House, and I won by 16 points. There was not a strong Democrat in. Served there for 16 years, ran for the United States Senate in 2006. when Senator Jim Jeffords, who many of you know, a very courageous person, chose not to run for re-election. He retired. We ran against one of the wealthiest guys in the state. Up until that point, the most that anyone had ever spent in an election in the state of Vermont was about $2.5 million. He spent $7 million. We had to raise $5 million, but we ended up winning by a very strong vote up for re-election in 2012. So that's my political history. Let me now take you to why you're here tonight. Let me talk a little bit about the book and read you from the introduction. On Friday, December 10th, 2010, I woke up at my usual time, had my usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee at the Dirksen Senate building, and then had a typical daily discussion with some of my staff. At 10:30 a.m., I walked onto the floor of the Senate and began a speech. Turned out to be a very long speech, a modern version of the filibuster. It went on for 8.5 hours until 7 p.m. There were several reasons why I went to the floor for that speech. First, I had promised to do everything I could to oppose what I believed was a very bad tax agreement between President Barack Obama and the Republican leadership. At a time when this country has a $13.8 trillion national debt and the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country, it seemed to me totally absurd to provide hundreds of billions in tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. Further, by confirming, and this was the lame duck session before the Republicans took control of the House, further by confirming under a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, the basic tenets of Bush's horrendous trickle-down economic theory, this agreement was laying the groundwork for more bad decisions in the future. Unfortunately, I was absolutely right, and that takes us right to the Ryan Republican budget of today. Second, more tax breaks for the very rich is only one symptom of an economic and political system that is grotesquely failing the average American. The simple reality is that the middle class of America is collapsing, poverty is increasing, and the gap between the very wealthiest people and everyone else is getting wider. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What can we do about it? These are issues that had to be talked about, and talked about in a way that is not often heard in Washington. Over the 20 years that I had served in the House and the Senate, I had examined these issues far too often ignored by the corporate media and my colleagues in Congress, from a wide variety of perspectives. Now was an excellent opportunity to bring them together and to make the connections. What does it mean, morally and economically, that in 2007, the top 1% earned over 23% of all income in this country, more than the bottom 50%? Or that the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Given the enormous political power that goes with this concentration of wealth in terms of lobbying capabilities, campaign contributions, and media ownership, is the United States on its way to becoming an oligarchic form of society, with almost all power resting in the hands of a tiny few? What does it say about our economy and the political choices we make about it on Capitol Hill that today, despite all of the huge increases in productivity and technology that we've seen in recent decades, a two-income family now has less disposable income than a one-income family did 30 years ago? Why is it that Americans today work the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world? What is the correlation between the United States having by far the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country, while we also have more people in jail? Doesn't it make more sense to invest in our kids than in jail construction? How does it reflect upon our political and legal system when the crooks on Wall Street who caused this horrendous recession now earn more money than they did before their banks were bailed out by the taxpayers? How come none of them are in jail? And what does the financial reform bill mean when 3 out of the top 4 too big to fail banks in this country are now larger than they were before the Wall Street collapse, with assets of over half the